Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. I hope you're having an awesome day. I'm Craig, your tech fan, and as you know in this channel, I'm gonna do reviews of all things tech, especially things I've bought and I've owned them for a while, like this GH4, to let you know if it was worth the money or not worth the money. You saw the last episode, I went through all the different cameras I use in my cruising off-duty vlog style channel, from least used, maybe least liked, to most used. Which if you haven't seen that, go back and watch it, but the end result is my favorite two cameras was my original GH4 that I got when I started the channel, and then when I upgraded to the GH5, I love that camera, and there's not much I can say other than some people don't love the autofocus, but I tend to be a manual focus videographer anyway, so it's not a huge deal. But when I got in that video, I realized I shot a really detailed, all the stats, all the, the different features between the GH4 and the GH5 already on my cruising off-duty channel, because back then I didn't have this channel to do reviews of tech. So I sometimes interlaid like one video that would be just a tech review in the middle of my sailing vlog channel, and that's why I've separated this channel out so that I can do that here, because not everybody on that channel necessarily wants to know about the camera specs. So what I've decided is, why reinvent the wheel? Since my favorite two cameras were the GH4, which is an older model, and then the new replaced GH5, I'm going to run that episode now that I've already created for that past channel, and you'll see all the specs. I'll get really detailed in that one. So if you're interested in either buying the GH4, which I just checked on Amazon is about $1,000 US on Amazon.com, or the GH5, which I'm filming on right now, it's about $2,000, so it's twice the price. And quite honestly, if somebody was just starting out to do a YouTube channel or whatever, or they're on a budget, I honestly say I would suggest get the GH4. It doesn't have a few of the features, but for $1,000 versus $2,000, that's a big jump in price. And that generally happens when a company comes out with a better camera. The old camera drops significantly in price. So this camera is awesome, especially on a powered gimbal, because the only thing this didn't have that the GH5 did have was in-body image stabilization. This didn't have it. So I found when I walked and talked, you would see the shake. But now that I have a powered gimbal, this is the Crane M, the Zhiyun Crane M, it works perfectly on this, and it makes it silky smooth. So hey, if you can get yourself a Crane M, then you probably can live with a GH4. The only other thing the GH5 does that for me I thought was a big thing, but I don't end up using it as much as I thought I would, is it shoots 4K at 60 frames per second, which means if you want to shoot all your vlogs in 4K, but you also like to slow things down from time to time, being able to shoot at 60 frames per second, but publish at 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second means you can take that crispy 4K footage and slow it down. With this, it only shoots 4K at 30 frames per second, and Cinema 4K, which is the even bigger 4K, at 24 frames per second. So if you're only going to shoot your videos mostly in 1080p anyway, which a lot of people do because the file size of 4K gets huge, then you're probably going to end up being just fine with the GH4. And for $1,000 for the body, that's a pretty good deal. Anyways, let's run that footage. All right, let's get into this. Okay, so let's go into ergonomics, size, weight, and layout. The GH4 is on the left and the GH5 is on the right. You'll notice the GH5 is just a little bit bigger. It's also a little bit heavier, but you don't really notice that. It's mostly noticeable in the grip area. The GH5's grip is bigger than the GH4's grip, and I think that's a good thing. I have large hands, so having a bigger grip just made the camera feel easier to hold onto. One thing that won't be apparent is the GH4 on the left above the Lumix symbol had a pop-up flash, and the GH5 they've just done away with it, and I don't disagree with that. I never use the pop-up flash. The GH4 and GH5 are more videographer type cameras instead of photographer cameras, but if you need a flash, you probably have an external one. On the GH5, they moved that red record button from the back of the camera to the top. Here it is on the GH4 on the back. And here's some things you wouldn't notice right away by looking at it, but the viewfinder and the screen have both been updated. I've put the exact specs on the screen, but generally you'll find that the resolution on the viewfinder went up by 55% and the resolution on the screen went up by 56%. Also, the screen went from 3 inches to 3.2 inches. Not only have they made the screen bigger with better resolution, they've also made it brighter. Not that the GH4 was any slouch in that area, but the GH5 should be even easier to use on sunny days. They've also added a thumb joystick, which gets you through the menus much quicker than the rotating wheel in the bottom right corner. So that great touchscreen that the GH4 had has gotten even better, and this is what it looks like when you can pivot it around and look at yourself when you're filming. So this new higher resolution screen will not only make it easier to see what's in focus, but now the menu shown here on the GH4 goes from 5 rows of information to 8 rows of information on the GH5. So now when you're trying to get into the menu to find that one setting you want to change, you don't have to go through quite so many screens to get there. Here's a huge improvement that you don't see on too many cameras. See, the GH4 had the typical one SD card slot. The new GH5 has 2, and they're the higher speed SD card slots at that. In the menus, you can customize how these SD card slots are recorded to. You can have it go in series, which means when SD card slot 1 is full, it starts recording onto SD card slot 2. You can have them both recording simultaneously, which means you always have a duplicate of everything you've recorded. Or you can tell it that you want all your videos to go on one card and all your photos to go on another. If you're recording in series and you open this door, there's a little light showing you which SD card slot is being recorded to. So if it's recording on SD card slot 2, which means SD card slot 1 is full, you can just pop in a new one and keep recording. If you were plugged into AC power, you could just keep recording until you run out of SD cards. They've also added one additional customizable function button on the front of the GH5, which was not there on the GH4. Now they've made the GH5 weatherproof and freeze-proof, and you can definitely tell from the doors that it's more substantial now on the GH5. That's the GH4, and you can literally just pop the door open with one finger. The GH5 definitely takes a lot more effort. You actually have to hold the camera with one hand while you pull with the other hand to get it to pop open. It's got a more substantial feel, which is good, but you can't just flick it open with your thumb like you did on the GH4. It just feels like a better build quality on the GH5. And even though it takes a little more effort to open the doors, I think it's a good thing for weather sealing. The same can definitely be said about the doors on the other side, which is for your earphone jack and your HDMI access ports. The GH4 that you see here has sort of rubber doors, and when you let them go, they just sort of flop shut. There's really no hinge. You'll notice here on the GH5 that the doors are more substantial and they actually have a hinge. So when you open them, they stay open. It just gives me a lot more confidence that this thing has the quality build that will make it weather sealed like they say it is. Another welcome addition to the GH5 is now it's a full-size HDMI out to a TV set or other monitor, and also a very modern USB-C type connector. The USB-C type connector is very forward-thinking. Okay, enough of what the camera looks like from the outside. More importantly, what are the specs? What can this camera do compared to the GH4? Well, the easiest and quickest way to do this is just break it down in columns. The GH4 had a 16 megapixel sensor and the GH5 now has a 20 megapixel sensor, so that's much better for those photographers amongst us that want those really crisp photos. Okay, this next feature was one of the features I really look forward to and why I bought the GH5. It's the image stabilization. You see, the GH4 has none, and the GH5 has in-body image stabilization, which is a 5-axis stabilization. And then when you match it up with a lens that's image stabilized, you get dual stabilization, which from all accounts of those that have tested this camera a lot longer than I have, it is awesome. And that's going to be something I'm really going to use on my channel. Because I tend to run and gun when I film, I very rarely have my camera on a tripod, and so image stabilization is something I really need. Now the next area that they've improved on still probably hasn't been improved as much as some people would like, the focus points or the autofocus. The GH4 used 49 points to autofocus and the GH5 uses 225. I did some quick tests doing autofocus on my face while I walked around and then looked at things and then looked at my face again to see how quickly it would get back in focus, and I found it quite acceptable. It's probably not as good as some of the Sonys, but the GH5 has so many other features that it's better than the Sonys that I don't mind the autofocus not being wonderful. I have a lot of Nikon lenses that I've adapted with a Metabone speed booster onto my camera, so most of my lenses are manual focus anyway. So autofocus wasn't a huge selling feature, although it would always be nice to have the perfect camera. And by most people's accounts, the GH5 would be that perfect camera if it only had better autofocus. It seems to be the only gripe that people have on it. Okay, some of the other features that it has is now you're going to be able to do 6K photos from videos, as opposed to before it was a 4K video at max. As I mentioned before, your viewfinder's got much more dots. Your LCD screen is 0.2 inches bigger and way more dots. Bluetooth. It now has Bluetooth to connect to your iPhone or whatever else you want to connect to send your photos to Instagram or whatever you want to do. Before it was just Wi-Fi. And now it records in 10-bit 422. Before it recorded in 8-bit 420. So those that don't know what that means, it's mostly just how many colors are captured. With the 8-bit, you captured something like 16 million color variations, and with the 10-bit 422, it's going to be something like 1 billion color variations, which just means the color accuracy is going to be better and therefore less need for color correction. Now I mentioned there was 2 things that I bought the GH5 for. One was the image stabilization, and the next one was the next feature, the slow-mo. The way we figure out slow-mo is how many frames per second can the camera shoot. At 1080 resolution, the GH4 could shoot 96 frames per second at its maximum. The GH5 has bumped that up to 180 frames per second. Something that would look boring at regular speed looks kind of cool when you get it slowed down. For example, this footage here, since it's raining today, I didn't have much other option. I just decided to film the raindrops falling off the edge of my roof. So I've got it shooting 180 frames per second, and I told to render the video at 24 frames per second. So that means it slowed it down to 13% of its normal speed. And it does that all inside the camera. So when you get the footage out and put it into your computer, it's already slowed down. You can imagine if I showed you this video at full speed, it would be the most boring video ever. But when you watch raindrops falling in super slow-mo, it's kind of cool. So this is a feature I've been looking forward to. The GH4 could also do it in 1080, but only up to 96 frames per second. So this is a big improvement. So that's what it can do in 1080p. What can it do at 4K? Well, it can also do slow-mo. The GH4 can only shoot at 30 frames per second, and since most people either shoot at 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second, you might as well say there was no such thing as slow-mo on the GH4 in 4K. Now it'll shoot at 60 frames per second. So even if you're rendering at 30 frames per second, you still are getting 50% slow-mo at 4K. That is almost unheard of level of performance at this price level of any camera on the market right now. There are other competitors on the market that shoot in 4K as well, of course, but there's some cameras that say they can do it, but then they overheat when you ask them to film for more than like 5 minutes. The GH4 never had a problem, could shoot 4K all day, never overheated, and the GH5, from everything I've heard, is the same. Another thing that's not mentioned on this little graph or chart here is that the battery life of the GH4 was unbelievable. I mean, pretty much best in industry in how long you could run on one battery. The Sony, for example, very good camera, but people said you'd have to carry stacks of batteries with you if you're going to shoot for an afternoon. They just blew through batteries like you wouldn't believe. I love that Panasonic stuck with the exact same batteries as the GH4 for the GH5. It saved me a ton of money not having to buy a whole bunch of new batteries. I can just use the batteries I already have. But as we know, the GH5 is a much more powerful camera than the GH4, and just like a car, if you put a bigger engine in it, it's going to go through gas faster. So even though the GH5 is probably still way, way better than a lot of its competitors in how long a battery will last, it's not going to last as long as the GH4. Battery's rated to do 530 shots per charge on the GH4 and only 410 shots per charge on the GH5. One thing to mention here about the double SD card slots, it's not only that there's 2 instead of 1, it's that there's 2 at this higher V60 class of card. This is the newest technology in SD card. These cards are the ones that are super fast, and they're going to be needed if this camera is going to give out 400 megabytes per second video. Well, overall, some very impressive stats, and if nothing else, I wanted it for the image stabilization and the super slow-mo. How do you get dual image stabilization? Well, when you have a Lumix lens like this that has power OIS, and you also have the in-body stabilization, they talk to each other and they work together to make dual image stabilization. Now, you don't need to have Panasonic lenses to work on a Panasonic camera. A lot of my lenses are actually Nikon mounts, and I connect to them by using a Metabone speed booster. This is one of my favorite lenses. It's a Sigma 17 to 50 millimeter lens. It's a Nikon mount, so it doesn't go right onto my Panasonic, so I have to connect to it through the Metabone speed booster. It's a great piece of glass, and it's a fast lens, which means that it lets in a lot of light. It's a 2.8 throughout the 17 to 50 millimeter range, which is pretty impressive. It also has optical stabilization, which is good, but since it's not connected directly to the camera's not aware that that's going on, so I don't get the little logo that says Dual IS is turned on. This is my other favorite lens. It's the Tokina 11 to 16, and it's a super wide angle lens. Great for vlogging if that's what you wanted to do, but more just for wide landscape shots. So this is the Metabone speed booster. This is what allows me to connect the Nikon lenses onto my Panasonic camera. It's got another great feature or two. One is that it brings in more light than natural. So my lens that was a 2.8 turns into a 2.4, and my Nikon on the left there that's a 1.8 turns into a 1.4. So shooting with these lenses will make the camera better in low light conditions. One other thing that wasn't mentioned yet is this sensor is a 4/3 sensor, which means when you look at a lens and it says it's a certain millimeter, you have to multiply that number by 2. So this Nikon 50 millimeter, let's do the math with that. It's my fastest lens at 1.8. My Metabone speed booster, it drops that 1.8 to about 1.4. If I didn't have the Metabones, that 50 millimeter lens on my 4/3 sensor would act like a 100 millimeter lens, so much more zoomed in than you would think. So here's what it looks like when the Metabones is attached to the lens and the camera. You can see from the Metabones part, it says Ultra 0.71. So without boring you with the calculations, what it comes down to is this 50 millimeter lens, which should have acted like a 100 millimeter lens, actually acts like a 70 millimeter lens. And even though the lens is quite fast at 1.8, the Metabones actually makes it even faster, which means even more light gets in at a 1.4. And all this is really just to tell you that even if you have Nikon glass or Canon glass, you can get a Metabone speed booster to connect those lenses to your GH5 or GH4. When it comes right down to it, I loved my GH4, and I've already invested quite a bit of money in this glass plus 2 Lumix lenses to go with my GH4. So I was kind of motivated to stay with Panasonic as opposed to jumping over to Sony or some other brand, because then I'd have to, sell off a bunch of lenses. They always say you invest in glass because a good lens can last you decades. But a camera body might only last you 5 years before the technology will catch up with it. But if you're just starting out, would a GH4 be good? Probably yes. I mean, if you don't need super slow-mo and 1080 and you can live with just the max at 96 frames per second, and if you don't need 4K at 60 frames per second, and if you don't really care that much about image stabilization, then a GH4 is an awesome camera. You can probably get that body for about $1,000. And I'm talking new. You can probably pick it up even less used. But if you want to spend more for the GH5, you're going to have to spend $2,000 US just for the body. And if you don't have any lenses yet, you can count on at least $500 per lens. But with all the features, I'm very happy with my GH5. I'm still going to use my GH4 as my secondary camera. In fact, I actually have a third camera which I kind of need as well, and it's my G7X, which is my vlogging camera. You see, when I'm vlogging around town, I like to be a little discreet. I don't think this qualifies as discreet. Actually, it's even more embarrassing and uncomfortable than what I'm showing you here, because usually when there's wind, I have to put this dead cat on top, which is like a squirrel attacking my camera. So when you're in a public place, you always want something a little more discreet, like this G7X. So this is my third camera, and one I'm really happy with. It's got some built-in image stabilization, and it's really good in low light. Well, in less than a week, our boat gets launched, and we go down the Thousand Islands to the Great Lakes. And I'm sure I'm going to get tons of use out of all 3 of these cameras, but especially the GH5. Well, I hope you found the comparison between my GH4 and my new GH5 to be helpful. If so, give it a thumbs up. And hit the subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. I left links to all the gear I described in the description below. If you're new to the channel, we just went to the BVIs and chartered a catamaran, which was some pretty cool episodes. So go back and check them out. If you'd like to help support the channel, please go to patreon.com/cruisingoffduty for more information. And until next time, this is Craig signing off, wishing you safe cruising.